Darwin's proposition is grounded on the notion of variation. It argues that the multitudinous traits and acclimations that separate species from each other also explain how species evolved over time and gradationally diverged. Variations in organisms are apparent both within tamed species and within species throughout the natural world. Variations in colors, structures, organs, and physical traits separate a multitude of species from one another. Heredity is the medium that perpetuates variations, Darwin argues, as traits are passed from parents to seed. What's important about these variations to Darwin, however, is the way they allow species to acclimatize and survive in the natural world. He gives multitudinous exemplifications of variations that illustrate the stupendous acclimations that allow species to survive in their natural surroundings: the beak that allows the woodpecker to gather insects, the bodies that allow the club to fly, the paddles that allow the porpoise to swim, and so on. Darwin hypothesizes that the minor variations we see within a single species, similar as variations in size, shape, and color of organisms, are related to the further distinct variations seen across different species. His proposition of elaboration explains how variations beget the origin of species. Natural selection is the crucial element of Darwin's proposition, as it explains the relationship between variation and the eventual elaboration of a species. Borrowing from Thomas Malthus's principle of exponential population growth, Darwin argues that the possibility of horizonless growth of population sizes is checked by the limits of terrain and natural coffers, which won't allow an horizonless number of beings to survive. As a result of limited food, water, sanctum, and so on, species must engage in a struggle for actuality, creating competition for survival. What decides, also, which species will survive and which will come defunct? Then's where natural selection comes by. Darwin argues that organisms flaunting profitable variations that will allow them to acclimatize to their terrain better than other organisms do, will be more likely to survive. Through heredity, these profitable variations will be passed on to the organism's seed. Ultimately, natural selection will allow those species stylish acclimated to their surroundings to survive and prosper, while species without these profitable acclimations will lose the struggle for actuality and come defunct. Natural selection is the medium that leads to descent with revision, Darwin's term for the process of elaboration. Organisms will continually give birth to seed that carry variations, some of which are profitable and some of which are not. As profitable variations are naturally named and come eternalized through consecutive generations, organisms carrying these profitable variations will diverge from the original species, ultimately getting a species of their own. Continual revision and divergence, also, produce a branching scheme of elaboration, in which new species continually branch off from old bones. The branches help biologists link latterly species back to an original parent species, relating the point at which different species are related to one another. Darwin notes that being bracket systems developed by naturalists formerly show these connections between species. Darwin's proposition of descent with revision, also, simply provides an explanation for why numerous species feel so analogous: either they evolved from one another, or they both evolved from a common parent species. After laying out the main principles of his proposition in the early chapters of Origin of the Species, Darwin devotes much of the rest of the book to defending his proposition against examens and presenting detailed exemplifications of how natural selection occurs. The geological record is a redoubtable manacle to Darwin's proposition, as the being reactionary record doesn't give the missing links in the chains of descent that Darwin proposes. In response, Darwin argues that the geological record is amiss and that numerous reactionary remains have been destroyed by changes in the Earth or have yet to be discovered. Darwin also attempts to explain how variations do in species, driving natural selection and the creation of new species. Geographical insulation is a crucial element of Darwin's proposition. Darwin hypothesizes that because all species began from one or a many original beings, species demanded modes of transportation to resettle between geographical areas throughout the world. Walls similar as abysses and mountain ranges circumscribe the capability of organisms to resettle, and the many that manage to do so play a large part in shaping the elaboration of species on islets and in geographically insulated areas. Geographical insulation accounts for the plethora of unique species on islets, as well as the wider distribution of species across mainlands. Darwin's proposition challenged not only the prevailing view of the independent creation of species but also larger claims of religion and wisdom. Darwin explicitly denied the validity of natural theology, which posited that species' acclimations to their surroundings was evidence of their intelligent design by a creator. It was natural selection, not independent creation, that redounded in these acclimations, Darwin argued. Also, Darwin's use of scientific methodology to prove his proposition amounted to an unequivocal notice of naturalists who would essay to ignore the scientific validity of his proposition because of its controversial nature. While the textbook of The Origin of Species did leave room for religious theology, Darwin's overall commitment to scientific explanation rather than theological logic leveled him against religious doctrine. Darwin's textbook was controversial when it was published, and it remains controversial moment. Still, his proposition of natural selection has stood the test of time in scientific circles, and it remains the leading scientific explanation for the origin of species.